everybody, welcome to another Spectrum Economics video. Today I'm starting off a new series. This is what I'm going to call the dark side of economics. So this is going to be looking at some of the negative things that can be achieved by using economics, how it's been used for bad and how it's been used for manipulation, and how basically we have suffered in a sense because of the use of economics. And I'll be covering later on another side of it in terms of how we can actually look past some of this bad stuff. But first of all, we need to identify what those bad things are and how that's actually affecting us as people. So there's a number of different topics I'm going to be talking about. This video I'm just going to do a very quick summary, and I'm going to do a few more videos where I'm going to be looking at a lot more detail in terms of what these bad things are and how, how it affects our lives. Okay, so first off, government expenditure. This is something that most people would probably think would be a good thing. And potentially it could be a good thing, but it's often angled towards very big projects, very expensive projects that obviously serve a purpose and solve problems, but at the same time they also create problems. And they're often exaggerated in terms of the benefits that you actually get out of it. And also as well, it isn't always clear, in fact, who are benefiting out of it. Whereas you're building more roads, for example, who is really benefiting from it? Is it your everyday people, or is it more big business in terms of how they're transporting their goods, and how is that passed on to the consumers, if anything at all, or is it just a profit driving function? And in a sense as well, those are actually building and all that, and there's a lot of profits that go into very large construction projects, and a lot of our taxpayer dollars go into these projects. So that's just something that I'll be talking about in terms of how that's done and how it's not entirely clear exactly who is getting the benefits out of it. But once you look deeper into it, you can actually see a lot of this stuff. It offers, in many ways, a short-term solution and often creates other problems that are not clearly identified. Another thing as well is how government works with the private sector in terms of who are they really working for? Are they working for the people, as many people would like to hope and like to think? We have elections and things like that, and the appearance that people are putting in governments into power and certain particular people into power, certain politicians, but who are they really serving? And we'll look at the relationship between the government and the private sector, and in terms of what influence the private sector have on government and government on private sector and vice versa, and how do people actually fit in there, if at all. Another thing we'll look at, and this is something there's actually a lot of YouTube videos about, High Impact Flicks has done actually dozens, maybe even hundreds by now, focusing on tax and what is tax, and basically how it is it can be used as a form of exploitation. People always argue that tax has a good effect in the sense that it funds projects and stuff like that benefit us, but there's elements of tax and that money that goes into things that we have very little to say about. And also there's the compulsory nature, especially of income tax. You earn an income, that money is just taken from you and you have no say. And it's a bit of a rights issue around that. People may argue, others may argue that it's just something that's always been, always the case. And I've got a video that's going to talk a little bit more about taxation and how it's used and how it can be seen to be, well, how it is in a way, can be used to manipulate. Another thing I want to talk about would be prevention versus cure. This is often relates to a lot of things in relation to government. And if you look at it in terms of health, you have prevention, you have cure, and you have treatment. Treatment being a large focus and something that almost comes naturally, like in terms of health. You build hospitals as a form of treatment. You have chemotherapy as a form of treatment. But very little attention is ever placed on prevention. And there's some on cure, but almost nothing on prevention, because at least if you prevent a problem, there is no problem to solve. As I mentioned in previous videos, government love problems. The more problems, the better. The more solutions that you can offer. And it's something that keeps the money rolling in. You always have a problem that needs solving. And if you have prevention, you don't have those problems, and government doesn't get to be seen to be doing things if there are no problems. And that is a key driver behind a lot of things, is actually having those problems. And prevention is something that's never really very popular. Even though in terms of economics, you can work it out in terms of how much the people benefit, prevention is actually far better than treatment, far better than cure. One other thing I want to talk about as well, this relates to subsidies. I talked about taxation, so then the subsidies. And subsidies is not a huge driver of economic growth, but it can be used to benefit particular industries. And one that I always like to talk about is the meat and dairy industry and the amount of money that governments put into that. And by putting lots and lots of money into that, it actually prevents alternatives becoming viable. If you go to the shop and you can get milk for $1, you're less likely to pay $3 or $4 for an alternative milk that may actually be healthier and may actually be cruelty-free. But these subsidies, and on meat in particular, and also the exclusion of the cost to the environment and all that, that's not factored in meat prices, but instead they get a subsidy. So you're talking about meat that's being sold at a fraction of what it actually costs to the world as a whole. So stuff like that, subsidies can be used as a form of manipulation. It's intended to promote goods and services that is for the benefit of humanity, benefit of mankind. Basically, that's what it's intended to do. But in many cases, it's more for the benefit of the larger companies. It keeps them in a position where others can't compete with them. And it's not just the meat industry. You can look at it in terms of energy, in terms of power. You can look at it in terms of pharmaceuticals. A lot of things you can look at it in terms of how subsidies actually keep a particular group in power rather than encouraging us to buy a particular good or service. Another thing I'll be talking about, I'll be looking at money and the creation of money and how central banks create money, and in a sense that there is almost no control over what they do. They're their own independent bodies. So no matter what happens, even if, let's say, you live in a democracy, for example, but if you have a central bank that controls the money supply, there is no way that you can actually prevent that unless you bring the money supply and the central bank back under the government rather than it being a privately owned company. Well, what I want to talk about, something that's related to what I've done over the years, and that's cost-benefit analysis. And a lot of things that you see in the newspaper these days, it's backed by what we call cost-benefit analysis. And this is what governments like to do to justify their very, very expensive projects. They say, hey, look at this. Benefits outweigh the costs. And what I'm going to be talking about in the video to come about cost-benefit analysis is how there are tactics to manipulate the results of a cost-benefit analysis. Like, for example, certain things can be exaggerated. Growth rates, for example, and it's very hard to disprove. The base case, something that is the state of the world without the project, and that is a very easy one to manipulate, and it's very hard to go back 5-10 years later, because if you built something and the base case doesn't actually happen, so it's very hard to say that what you're saying is wrong. So there are very, very clever ways of manipulating the facts using cost-benefit analysis, and I've got quite a lot of information on that will be very, very interesting. How about health? I mentioned earlier about prevention and cure and stuff like that. There's another side of health as well. Certain things that are being promoted, certain types of treatment that don't make you better, or certain types of products like cigarettes, for example. The amount of damage that cigarettes do to your health, yet they're not banned. That you have something else like marijuana that actually does less damage to your health, which is banned. Again, it's looking at money. There's more money to be made in the cigarette industry, because there's many, many big cigarette companies and they make a lot of money, even regardless of the taxation. And a lot of that tax just gets pushed onto the consumer. And if you have an addiction, then you tend to pay the higher price because you can't move away from that product because of your addiction to nicotine. There are things out there that could be helping, like there's these new vapor cigarettes and stuff like that, these electronic cigarettes that produce vapor instead of smoke. That is a healthy alternative, what appears to be at this point in time, until evidence comes to produce that some of the chemicals in there could be causing harm. At this point it's hard to say, but health is going to be something I'm going to be talking about in terms of how there's been a certain amount of manipulation in regards to the health side. And as I mentioned before, more emphasis on building hospitals and stuff rather than actual treatments and all that. And we'll talk about as well what these treatments are doing, like in relation to cancer rates. We'll talk about vaccines as well, how are vaccines helping or not helping, or in a sense causing problems. So we'll talk about that in another video. How about bail-ins and bailouts? This is something that happened in 2008. That was when there was bailouts of the big banks, when basically it all went pear-shaped for them. They were losing hundreds of millions, billions of dollars, and basically the government just bailed them out using the idea of, what was it, too big to fail, I think was pushed around, moral hazard, which is actually a very important concept in economics, meaning that if you believe that, or if you know that no matter what happens, someone will always be there to bail you out, you'll take risks that you wouldn't normally take. You take a risk and you lose everything, and that's it, you're done. Whereas with moral hazard, you take a risk and you lose everything, but you get it back again because of the bailouts, and then you'll be more inclined to take those risks because you're not really losing when things go wrong. And that's, again, that relates to greed and stuff like that. And also there's bail-ins, I think, that happened within Greece, and this is not the government directly bailing them out with your tax dollars, it's actually taking money from your bank account. So it's just another way of taking your money, but potentially you could see your savings in a bank disappear through a bail-in. So it is actually quite scary stuff, and in the end all of it is around about supporting the banks. So the banks can play as risky as they like and be as greedy as they like and make enormous profits because they can take these risks knowing that if everything goes pear-shaped, the money will always be there to bail them out. How about the stock market? Something along similar lines. Again, it's an interesting one. People argue it's a good thing, it's a bad thing, but speculation drives up prices in many cases, and bubbles and things like that. That is where, your price of certain things are higher than what they should be because of expectations. It gets more blown out of proportion when you have the stock exchange and the stock market. Again, it's a very good way of moving money around. There's some positive sides to it as well, and you can have a lot more growth out of it. But potentially when things go wrong, they can really, really go wrong. As we've seen over time, as we saw in 2008, you go back to the Great Depression, and a lot of it isn't just business related, it's basically business confidence. It's the belief, and then belief becomes reality. You believe something's going to go wrong, then it actually goes wrong. You believe something's going to be great, then it actually is great. Well, for a while anyway, until the truth eventually comes out, and then you get hit a lot harder than you would before. But yeah, we'll talk about that in another video. How about currency manipulation? This is something that is done by a few countries, and I think China has been accused of keeping their money, their currency, lower than what it should be. And again, that is a way of getting very, very cheap exports and control markets overseas. And many, many countries are flooded with Chinese products and all that because of their low exchange rates. So it keeps their prices very, very competitive. And that is good for Chinese businesses, I agree, and other countries have done the same thing. It's not necessarily good for their citizens, though, having a weak currency, meaning that they can't improve their quality of living by having a currency that's worth more money. In terms of when you go overseas and things like that, they're losing out, but it works well for their business. How about materialism? This is something I've covered in a few of my other videos, and it's interesting because in terms of economics, we're always pushing about, getting more money, buying more things, being satisfied by material wealth. We're, in fact, many economists call people, they don't call us people, they call us consumers, in the sense that is our role, to constantly consume, constantly buy more things, which is generating income, which is increasing your gross domestic product, your national income figures, and all of that. But what is more important than just owning material wealth is your level of happiness. And this is something that I've talked about a few times. We'll talk about it again, focusing more on the negative side of this, and I can relate back to one of the other videos when I talk about valuing time rather than valuing materialism, material goods and things like that, Spending money you don't have for stuff that doesn't really make you happy. And that, again, that's another way of keeping you tied to your job, tied to always constantly needing more money. Another thing I want to talk about is monopoly power, and this is interesting that, we talk about restricting monopoly power, but you look at the world today, how many companies there are, underlying companies that own lots and lots and lots of other companies. You've got companies like Nestle, Coca-Cola, Mars, Disney, Johnson & Johnson, Pepsi, and they own so many companies, and it's sort of a monopoly, oligopoly kind of structure. It's quite interesting, but it's all designed basically to make money and have more profits. And these companies are very profitable, they're very rich. And it's a way of increasing your income inequality, or wealth inequality, should I say, in the sense that the wealth is going to the bigger companies and going to that, it's not even the 1%, or like the 1%, it's more like the 1,000th or even the 1 millionth of the population that is actually getting all this wealth. So I'd actually probably move away from 1% because it's actually much smaller than that, the people that are actually have the power and earning all that money. Another thing I want to talk about as well is, you could argue that it still comes under economics in terms of behavior economics, but the way people act in terms of need to be part of a crowd, need to be part of a group, and it's actually quite powerful in the sense that people will abandon their own beliefs and all that just to follow belief of someone else because they think that that is the thing to do and there's other people doing that. You know, it's like someone's got a mobile phone, you've got to have a mobile phone. You know what I mean? Someone's got a smartphone as well. Or you've got to be within a particular certain type of club, you've got to like certain things, you've got to do certain things. And the whole herd mentality, or is known as sheeple, I think is another one, walking around like sheep, allows us to be manipulated. And when you can be manipulated more easily, then it makes it easier for certain people to hold power. And when you have that, it's being able to break away from that. I think there's a certain instinct that there is security and strength within numbers, but if we're all following each other and rather thinking about what we're actually doing and what we actually want, then a lot of good stuff is lost, you know, just doing something for the sake of someone else or the sake of the group. So I think that is something that needs to be explored, and I'll have a video in terms of what the herd mentality is and how companies that way anyway can benefit so much from this herd mentality, and how the people, us, can actually suffer so much by not really identifying what we really want in life. And I think that we need to talk about is war. And that's interesting in a sense that war and economics, the link, well, it's actually quite a link really, because like if you go back to the Second World War, for example, at that time countries were in recession and depression and all that, and then you have a war, and then there is massive expenditure on all the war machine and stuff like that, and you can increase employment, you can actually greatly reduce unemployment, greatly increase income and all of that by having a war. So hold on, is war good or is it bad? Well, obviously it's bad because people are dying and it's wastage basically. You go in there and you're destroying other people's property, you're destroying other people's lives, you're destroying everything. But in terms of economics, it can actually be twisted to look like it's a good thing. Like you're looking at higher income, could be a good thing, more investment, a good thing, less unemployment is a good thing, you're getting out. That's why it is so twisted that something like war can actually show up in the statistics as actually being something that's good and something that's desirable. And again, we could be looking at a World War III if we're going to be thrown into a recession or even a depression sometime fairly soon, and that is almost acts as a solution to that depression by the extra government expenditure and extra employment by having people. And also you're going to have reduced population, which is another thing as well. You have less people, it makes certain things easier to manage because you've got less people to take care of. So if you look at it from the point of economics, it can be very easily twisted that war is actually a good thing. And also there's so much money to be made out of war, whether it's the banks lending money or whether it's the construction and all that takes place after the war's being taken, just the whole real building process as well, all the jobs and all that comes out, again shows up as being something that's positive. I even look at natural disasters, you know, like the tsunami within Indonesia and Thailand and all that, and Sri Lanka. After that, there was actually growth, economic growth and increased employment because of the rebuilding. So it's almost like bad things show up as being good in terms of economics, and something we'll talk about a lot more later on. Coming to the end of this introduction to the dark side, and that is just going to finish off with mass production. There'll be probably a few more topics I'll talk about a little bit later on. But what is mass production? Is that a good thing or is it a bad thing? Mass production, as you've seen with Fordism and all that, mass production of cars, and you can greatly reduce costs. But where does all that money go in terms of you're getting all this machinery in and technology? Yeah, it's partly technology, partly call the whole conveyor belt, the mass production and all that. It does take away a little bit in terms of competitiveness. Mass production means you're going to have large companies, and again we go along those lines of monopolies and all that, because mass production requires that amount of capital And so you may have a situation where, sure, you have reduced costs, but you result with more monopoly power. And also as well, the people within these production plants as well tend to be working very, very long hours. And again, especially you talk about countries, some of countries like China and Thailand and all that, and Indonesia, you're working these very, very long hours, and the quality of life is greatly reduced from that. And a lot of the savings that we're seeing from this mass production doesn't go back to the people that are doing the work, but it goes back to the entrepreneurs, if you want to call them, or the big companies, the big multinational companies, and they move their operations around to countries that basically can mass produce on the lowest possible costs, and that often results in them going to countries where your cost of labour is very low, wages and salaries are very, very low, because the other costs of capital may be somewhat similar. So it's mass production has resulted in cost savings, but at the same time it's also resulted in exploitation, and we'll be talking a little bit more about that later on in another video. Okay, that just takes me to the end of this introductory dark side of economics. I hope you found it interesting. There'll be many, many more videos. There's going to be a lot more focus coming out later. So if you like this, click the like button. And if you want to see more of these videos, remember to subscribe. I've also got many other videos out as well relating to microeconomics, a few on macroeconomics, and also the book I'm writing on vegan economics is actually going to be pulling in some of this dark side stuff I talked about today into that. And also something else I've been doing as well is I've got some economic puzzles that, again, that relates to game theory, but it's something you might want to have a look at as well. It could be quite interesting. So there's a lot of stuff on my channel. So like I said, if you're interested in that, hit the subscribe button, and thank you for watching today's video, and I'll be seeing more of you.